War is raging in Iran, but President Trump is setting his sights on another target, Cuba. Speaking on Monday, he expressed an interest in regime change, saying it may be a friendly takeover, it may not be a friendly takeover. And he didn't really make statements like that in his first term. So what has prompted President Trump's changing stance on Cuba? What are the potential opportunities and risks of pursuing regime change there? And what would the broader ramifications of Cuba truly being next be for the region and for the wider world? Welcome to State of Play. I'm your host, Will Todman, and in this podcast, the CSIS Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department brings together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. To discuss Cuba, we have Ryan Berg back in the studio. Ryan, of course, is director of our Americas program. Ryan, you're going for a record as the regional director who has the most regime change operations in their area. Maybe we'll see in 2026. Welcome back. Great
Thanks
to have you. And then also, I'm really delighted to welcome Carrie Filipetti onto the show for the first time. Carrie is the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition and a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. And critically for us, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela, and also Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela at the State Department during the first Trump administration. So I actually want to start right there, Carrie, if that's okay. And so
Sure.
Obviously you were following Cuba policy and shaping Cuba policy very closely under the first Trump administration. And as I said, it seems to me like things are shifting. So can you take us back a bit and give us a bit of the context of how President Trump did approach Cuba under his first term? Because, of course, this came after the so-called Cuban thaw that President Obama led, opening up or restarting diplomatic ties with Cuba and also easing some of the travel restrictions as well. So what was President Trump trying to achieve in Cuba in his first term?
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me join you. And it's great to be with you and with Ryan. So it's interesting because when you look at President Trump's first administration and his Venezuela policy, you can see a lot of similarities between the first administration and the second administration. I think that's also true on Cuba, although we were pursuing what would be considered a much more traditionally Republican approach to Cuba at the time. So in the first administration, we had seen how, notwithstanding President Obama's warming of relations with Cuba, the regime was committing more human rights abuses. There were more arbitrary detentions. The people of Cuba were suffering even more under that supposed warming than they had been previously. And so our approach was really to try to ensure that the regime was essentially starved from the resources that it could use to harm the Cuban people. So what we essentially did was we looked at a lot of the openings that Obama put forward. We rescinded most of those. And we also tried to target the core sources of the regime's income, which tended to be the remittances from people who had traveled abroad, their tourism sector, and of course the Cuban Doctors Program, which was a huge priority for our administration to target. We did see them as closely tied to the Venezuelan regime as well. We held both the Venezuelan regime accountable for Cuba's actions and vice versa. But we were not as focused on, let's call it changing the government, regime change, so to speak. In the first administration, in really either case, Venezuela or Cuba, you heard much more language about human rights and democracy.
And so was the feeling then that President Trump's strategy could bring about changes in behavior without changes at the top of the government? Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, it sort of depended who you asked. There were certainly people in the administration that would say we had a strategy of regime change even back then. But the reason I described it as more traditionally Republican is it was almost this idea. And by the way, I think this might be part of what Trump is pursuing now as well, where instead of doing what you imagine regime changes, taking out the leadership and installing somebody new or going to an election, it was really about how do you make sure that the regime doesn't have the resources that it needs, so it is required to make small economic reforms, which will then broaden into political reforms, which will then become political parties and a functioning democracy.
Yep.
And Secretary Rubio has alluded to this in his description of Cuba as well. So that may still be the functioning premise, and we're just using more aggressive rhetoric. But that, I would say, was the principle behind what we were doing.
Okay. Brian, did anything stand out to you from the first Trump administration about how it approached Cuba?
Well, he thought we were doing regime change.
Oh.
Well, to be fair, I think the U.S. government has a policy of regime change with respect to Cuba. Now, how each individual administration pursues it is, of course, different, how zealously which policy approaches they select. But legally speaking, the way I read the Helms-Burton Act, which was signed in a bipartisan fashion in 1996, is that the U.S. government has an approach to the island that does not allow us to normalize ties fully, trade with Cuba fully, until such time as Cuba is a democracy. And so that, to me, leads me to believe that, like, from a government perspective, we have a regime change policy in place, and it's one that was voted for in a bipartisan manner, going all the way back to 1996. So I think it's fair to say that the entire policy is regime change. The question is just how zealously each individual administration pursues it.
One of the interesting things to me seems about how President Trump has described the threat coming from these different countries. So from Venezuela, of course, we have, the narco terrorism and the link to narco terrorists that the Maduro regime represented. In Iran, President Trump talked about a missile program that could potentially reach the United States. And he made this case not that far before the war broke out, but I think did try to articulate that there was a real threat emanating from it. But maybe, Ryan, from what you're saying, it's not like there is a specific threat coming from Cuba. This is more a longstanding U.S. policy that they would like to see a democracy as a relatively close neighbor to the U.S. Is that fair to say?
I think that's part of it, but I don't want to be seen as downplaying Cuba's role in the axis of authoritarians that we've been discussing for many years now in terms of presenting threats in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela was a principal part of that, but I think we shouldn't dismiss the fact that Cuba also plays a sort of platform type role for China-Russia, particularly China-Russia. And we at CSIS have done a lot of work looking in specific at spy bases that China has controlled and maintained in Cuba, 4 of them in specific that we've identified. It's made the Chinese Communist Party very upset. There have been congressional hearings about it based on CSIS satellite imagery analysis. But there is a presence of China and Russia in Cuba, so I wouldn't want to minimize the security risks that Cuba presents to the hemisphere, even if it's not, say, of the same magnitude as a Venezuela.
I would also just add to that, as much as in the Trump administration, we did restrict American travel to Cuba, the fact is that Americans have regularly traveled to Cuba for vacation. It is technically banned by the U.S. government to do it for vacation purposes, but people still do it. And there is a significant national security risk to diplomats who are going to Cuba, to everyday citizens that are going to Cuba. I mean, let's not forget Havana syndrome, which has become in the news much more prominently now in light of reporting that perhaps the United States actually has access to this weapon that was used. It was targeted against American diplomats. Even outside of that, almost all of the hotels in Cuba are run by the military or the government of Cuba. And what that means is that you are regularly having American citizens spied on. You are having their journals being read. You're having their materials being gone through. So it's also a direct risk to those Americans who are traveling to the island. So there are more direct risks, in addition to, I fully agree with Ryan's assessment on their relationship to our ideological adversary of this axis of Russia, China, and Iran.
There's also this really interesting aspect. It's not perhaps maybe the top concern in the prioritization of Cuba threats, but there's a number of American outlaws that currently find home in Cuba that when they were on the lam, running from the long arm of the U.S. justice system, Cuba was a place where they suspected murderers and other kidnappers in Cuba, and so part of a situation where we could get a regime change or change of government or even an openness to more dialogue could be the extradition of some of those individuals back to the United States to stand trial.
Okay, great. Because I wanted to talk about some of the goals then, and so I had not anticipated a new extradition policy being on one of those.
There's
on the
a lot of
list.
congressmen that would be very happy with the extradition of certain individuals from Cuba.
Yeah, Carrie, you made an allusion at the start to some of President Trump's perhaps changing goals or echoes of goals when you were talking about his first term. So, how would you describe the current administration's goals when it comes to Cuba?
I think they are largely the same. I mean, I think we are trying to squeeze the regime once again. We are gratefully separating the regime from the people of Cuba, which was a major priority in the first administration as well. We've obviously increased the pressure in certain cases. We're using more of a approach where it's sort of addressing both the American trade, but also international trade with Cuba. So those are all much more expansive, but they haven't reinstated, for example, the flight restrictions to Cuba. There were a number of things that the Biden administration pulled away, like our remittance caps, I think they ended. So there are still things that they could continue to do. But all in all, it falls under the rubric of maximum pressure with, as President Trump has always done, an opening that, yes, could be regime change, the easy way or the hard way being the Maduro way or the Ayatollah way, and the easy way being you can still be in power nominally, but you will have to agree to these certain reforms, which I suspect would have to do with economic reforms, economic opening and privatization. And I would hope and encourage that they also be about human rights and democracy. So I do think it's very consistent with the first administration. You have the added bonus here of Secretary Rubio, who is very well versed on these issues and knows exactly who to target, how to target them. So that's partially why I'm hopeful that we'll have a more successful strategy than we did in the last administration.
He's hoping for his sake that this doesn't become his fifth job. Is it 4 that he's on right now? I've lost track.
I mean, if you count by the memes online,
Yeah.
it's an infinite number.
Yeah. So what's your assessment of the goals, but also maybe we should talk about the options that President Trump has, because ultimately the title of this episode is Cuba Next, sort of talking about a regime change operation, but that could look quite different. And Carrie, as you were just saying, that could be easier, it could be harder. So how do you see the options?
Well, I think the option that the administration is pursuing now, as Carrie mentioned through Marco Rubio, is the Backchannel talks. And I think it's really notable that the United States is not speaking with the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel. We're not speaking with the foreign minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez. We're just going straight past all of those individuals who currently hold power, and we're going straight to the Castro family. And that, I think, is very important because it indicates a serious assessment that's been done on the part of the U.S. government that the real power center, the locus of power still on the island, rests with the Castro family. And in the Obama administration, it's important, I think, to note that the opening that you mentioned in your intro was done through one of Raul Castro's sons, if I'm not mistaken. This is being done through his grandson, right? Raulito.
That's his name?
Raulito, the little Raul.
Okay.
And so he is, supposedly, he is more well-traveled than other members of his family. He understands kind of how the world works, and he's seen stuff outside of Cuba. Therefore able to compare sort of what Cuba looks like to what the rest of the world looks like. And the idea or the hope, I think, is that he's more pragmatic and less ideological. And perhaps open to some of these economic reforms that the U.S. would be pushing. We haven't gotten that many public articulations yet of what it is that the demand list would be, or the demand set would be, from the United States to the Cuban regime. I would commend to listeners an interview that Secretary of State Rubio did with John Micklethwait, who's the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, at the Munich Security Conference. It's a great 15 to 20-minute interview, of which about a quarter of that interview is discussing Cuba. And he talks mostly in that interview about economic reforms. And I think the line that stuck out for me mostly was, Cuba has an economic system that doesn't work. It has a system of economics that not even Lenin would recognize. So it's clear, I think, at least in the public articulation of the U.S. goals, is that there's a lot on the economic side as a way of kind of opening up potentially later in time political space in Cuba. What I think is clear, and this is important to say, is that for now, it doesn't seem as though there is an analog to the Venezuela situation, meaning there is a kind of Delcy Rodriguez that we can identify in Cuba to work with as an interim leader before a kind of transition-like scenario. I'm not sure that there's a perfect analog to what happened in Venezuela to what may end up happening in Cuba.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think this idea that the administration is promoting, this is probably going to get me in trouble for saying, but I'll say it anyway. This idea that the administration is promoting that the Delcy model is the preferred model for Iran or for Cuba is a ludicrous idea. The Delcy model is not a preferred model for anybody. Other than Delcy Rodriguez, where she gets to maintain power. She gets to pretend that she's making these reforms when really all she's doing is throwing an oil bone to the administration. Meanwhile, the people of Venezuela will continue to suffer. The opposition and all of their political leaders will continue to be put in prison. And we won't have actually addressed the core factor, which was that the Maduro regime, which includes Delcy Rodriguez, is the cause of the instability that the United States was worried about. And so I counter the notion that we should be pursuing this Delcy model, even while I agree with Ryan that even if they wanted to, they don't have that real option inside Cuba. And the other thing that I would say is there is a tendency for the foreign policy establishment to really undervalue the idea of ideology. We don't understand that. In the first administration, Jared Kushner was pushing, before the success of the Abraham Accords, he was pushing the economic plan for Palestine. And it was immediately rejected by the Palestinians. Why? Because it basically said, give up what you think is justice in order to make more money. That's not something that the Palestinians will ever do. And likewise, we ignored the grip that the ideology of Chavismo had in Venezuela when we underestimated Maduro's ability to depart. And I think the same is true here. Just because somebody is educated abroad, just because somebody has traveled abroad, does not make them a moderate. Just because they speak English well doesn't make them a moderate. This is a huge problem that the foreign policy establishment has always had in thinking that we can partner with these types of guys. And I really do challenge, I hope the administration is able to come to a negotiation. I don't think a negotiation with Cuba is going to be possible if we actually fundamentally also care about the human rights of the people on the island.
So would it be crazy to imagine an Iran-style, military option for Cuba? Is that, I quoted President Trump at the start and said it may be a friendly takeover, it may not be a friendly takeover. Is a not friendly takeover military action?
Perhaps my imagination is not rich enough, but I'm just not sure what that looks like. Right. I think it's easy to imagine what it looks like in the Venezuela scenario, even before Operation Absolute Resolve, because it was clear that the administration viewed Nicolás Maduro as the problem, right? And as the key component to a more or less like a frozen conflict, right? And if you're able to remove him precisely, surgically, and quickly, you can maybe thaw this conflict a little bit. As Carrie was saying, there really isn't an analog in Cuba because we've had 70 years of ideological weeding out of anybody who could potentially be more pragmatic or more interested in working with the United States. There's been a pretty ruthless campaign to weed those types out. And so what the equivalent of that looks like in Cuba, I'm not sure. And then on the practical side of things, you have the sheer fact that the operation to capture Maduro took 6 months of practice. They built a mock-up of his compound in North Carolina so that the Delta Force guys could practice what was a spectacular raid and just beautifully executed and tactically brilliant. You can't do these things every other week in Latin America, right? You really have to prepare and have a good game plan. And even if there was a kind of appetite to do this, it would take some time to prepare properly a tactical plan, on the level of a Venezuela-like operation for Cuba.
Yeah, I also think it's going to be really tough to do as long as we're continued in Iran, right? That actually does limit our ability, because I don't think President Trump wants to necessarily open up some kind of a new military conflict in our hemisphere while we are also engaged in the Middle East. I think it would be increasingly difficult for him to sell that to his base. His base wildly supports the operation in Iran, wildly supported the operation in Venezuela. But if you start adding more and more military operations, you're increasing the risk to American service members. I think you may start to see that change. So I think politically it would be quite challenging for him.
Okay. So I want to zoom out a little bit and say, what are some of the sort of risks and benefits of a regime change operation or effort? And then also, what are the broader ramifications? So maybe we can start on some of the benefits, maybe. So, I mean, you've talked about economic reforms in Cuba, hopefully the human rights piece, Carrie. I guess what would you see as the broader benefits to the region of a different Cuba?
Well, you would first and foremost really hinder Russia and China's role in the hemisphere. We have already made amazing inroads in limiting their ability to influence the region through our operation in Venezuela. Cuba is one of their major footholds. And if we were able to push them out of Cuba and have a friendly Cuba to the United States, it would be incredibly significant. Not to continue my focus on human rights, but that would be a really significant change as well. The people of Cuba have been suffering for decades under this regime. There's over 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba. There have been, I think, close to 10% of the population has fled even just in recent years. So we're not even talking about the major a departure from Cuba when the revolution first started. We are seeing that they're ranked as one of the worst in terms of freedom, according to Freedom House rankings. They're just below Iran, I believe, just to give you a sense of where they are. And today, there are people who are on hunger strikes that are at risk of dying because the regime does not provide adequate medical care. So the human rights situation would improve astronomically. And then from the perspective of the economy, Cuba would be an amazing boon for American industry, for global industry. It is a beautiful country were it not ruined by socialism and communism. And so I think that's something that appeals to the president as well. So it's the security, the economic, and the human rights.
I just flew over it and it looked very lovely.
So, yeah, I would say, I mean, Carrie's hit on the democracy and human rights piece and also on the economic development piece. Let me just maybe comment strategically or geopolitically. Again, I come back to those reports that we've done on China and its presence, especially in an espionage capacity. One has to think that those go away. If there's those 4 sites that we've identified, they go away as a pretty significant security risk to the United States. And that's, we think, mostly signals intelligence collection. So pretty much everything up and down the East Coast, looking at all of our military bases and space launches from Cape Canaveral and Southcom and what they're doing. There are a lot of very significant facilities along the eastern seaboard and in the Gulf area where they can have a set of eyes looking at those. If that's not there anymore, certainly our strategic position improves. And then on the Russia piece, it was 2 years ago now that was a bit unsettling when Russia, pulled in a nuclear sub and parked in Havana just to let us know that, they too can have a presence in the Western Hemisphere. But before doing so and before transiting the Florida Strait, they decided to test in the middle of the Atlantic some of their new Zircon hypersonic missiles, which was a bit of an uncomfortable feeling as well. And I imagine those types of visits would be off the table in a democratic Cuba. Let me just add one thing to what Carrie said about the economic piece, which is, from a strategic standpoint, Cuba is not really just a Latin American country from the trade perspective. If it normalized and we had a democratic Cuba, it's actually kind of a North American country in the sense that it makes sense to think about it in the context of, say, a North American style set of supply chains or a North American style trade agreement. If eventually that makes sense geographically, certainly it's in a position to be in that mix. And so that's quite interesting as well, in that it's a Latin American country, of course, but it could also potentially belong to kind of a North American mindset, given its proximity to Florida.
A new acronym coming, USMCA-C or something. Maybe that's too far away. How about the risks? Like, what should we be worried about, like, if this all went terribly wrong?
I mean, it's hard to answer that because things could go terribly wrong in a number of different ways. I think at this stage, part of why I think the administration is focused on Cuba is it's very hard for it to get worse. it's very hard for it to get more entrenched with Russia and China. It's very hard for it to get worse situations in terms of human rights or the humanitarian conditions. It is hard for it to become more ideologically opposed to the United States. So the risks of any action, it's sort of like it's hard to say that it will ever get worse. Obviously, there are significant risks if what we're talking about when we say regime change is some kind of a military operation. Mm-hmm. So then there are legitimate risks to Americans, to our intelligence services, to a number of different kind of things of that nature. But ultimately, I think part of Cuba's problem is that they've made themselves so much an adversary of the United States and so deeply entrenched in these issues that there's very little the United States can do that would make the situation worse.
Mm-hmm. Ryan?
Just one thing that Carrie hasn't mentioned in her pretty comprehensive list is migration.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big fears, I think, for any administration, but especially for this one, which is, I think, in my opinion, rightly, proclaiming that the border is under much better control than it was in the prior administration. The outmigration that could potentially come from either an operation or from a squeeze with an attempt at regime change that goes awry. You have to remember that at least 10% of the population left Cuba between, I think, 2020 and 2025. A million Cubans, right? It's even more if you look at the broader Latin American region, because a lot of those folks have attempted to come to the United States. Some have settled in other parts of the region. If you take a broader sweep view and look at not just more countries in the region, but also a little bit longer period of time, it's close to 1.5 million, right? So the outmigration from Cuba to other parts of the hemisphere has been substantial. And if the squeeze gets tough enough, hard enough, wretched enough, you risk the Cuban regime also encouraging this type of migration as well. To give you a sense of how they think about it, a lot of times the Cuban regime will refer to it as their nuclear option. Right? They haven't had a nuclear option since October 1962.
Yeah.
Right. And so they speak of migration oftentimes in terms of their nuclear option. So they know that's what the U.S. wants to avoid most is 500,000 Cubans in the Florida Straits on rafts trying to get to Florida.
Yep.
And that certainly is a potential risk in any kind of botched operation or a squeeze that's so strong that it really collapses Cuban society.
Yep. So then let's close out with our rapid fire round. So the first question, please, can you sum up the situation in Cuba or Cuba policy in one word or phrase?
I'll go first. So the word that I would use is decisive. And what I mean by that is it's decisive for Cuba's future as well as for President Trump's legacy, depending on which option they go with. Are they going towards a sort of soft, I'm going to call it Biden-esque, Obama-esque negotiation, or are they going towards real no-kidding change in the government? We've seen this play many times before, and I'm hoping that this becomes more of a watershed moment than just a repetition of the same effort over and over again.
So I'll speak from the perspective of, having looked at Cuba and watching its slide into where it is now, and I'll use the phrase "long time coming."
Okay. Yep. Okay. So next, then, the sort of great power competition question. So of the US, China, and Russia, who's up and who's down the most this week? And you can define this either as it relates to Cuba in the Western Hemisphere or more broadly. Ryan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I think I'm aware that we're recording this while there's active hostilities and conflict going on in Iran. So I'd have to say, after the U.S. has said it's hit more than 5,000 targets in Iran, there's only one answer that I can give to that question with global perspective. But with respect to Cuba, I think, frankly, probably going to sound like a broken record at this point, but China has a lot at stake that it could potentially lose in Cuba, going again back to some of those espionage centers that we've identified. I don't think people understand how important a platform this is. I mean, Cuba, what it offers is geography to a patron like China. And if something were to happen, it would certainly be yet another instance of China in particular, but also Russia not really being there for their supposed allies in the axis of authoritarians when they're needed most.
Yeah, I would say both globally as well as with respect to the Western Hemisphere, I think the U.S. is up. We just saw the Shield of the Americas summit. We saw major leaders come with a huge percentage of Trump's cabinet to speak about security cooperation. He is defining the agenda for the entire hemisphere. I don't think that would have been possible in previous administrations. And I think down is China right now. I think they have shown that they lack both the will and the capability to really defend their partners. We saw that in Venezuela. We saw that in Iran. I'm sure we will see that in Cuba, depending on what happens next.
Okay. So now then for the word or phrase that you would ban people from using, Carrie, what would you like to ban people?
Okay, so this is not related to Cuba, but this is something that I have been annoyed with ever since the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it's a totally different area. I hate that every time anybody talks about Afghanistan, they use the word debacle. We do not use that word in almost any other context. You can call it a disaster, which it was. I'm not disputing that it's not a good descriptor. Sonically, it's a horrible word, and we don't use it for anything else. And everybody just kind of netted around this idea, and it drives me nuts. So I have a banned words list on my team, and calling it the Afghanistan debacle is one of those words.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm very passionate about this.
Wouldn't have necessarily guessed that.
I know, it's totally out of the
blue. Ryan.
So I'll go with one that is Cuba specific, and I'd say blockade. I do really despise the word blockade because I think it's thrown around a little bit too easily when it comes to Cuba conversations, particularly with respect to countries in the region that support Cuba, because their trade is not, in fact, what is being inhibited. It's our own domestic laws that determine how we can trade, or in this case, not trade with Cuba based on the embargo. So a better way of putting it is an embargo. What is happening now is actually closer to a blockade in the sense that President Trump has passed an executive order that promises to make secondary tariffs on countries that would trade not everything, but just oil with Cuba. So that's still not technically a blockade, maybe with respect to one sector, but not across the board. And so this phrase oftentimes gets thrown around very easily in the region, and then it's oftentimes part of a defense by Latin American countries of Cuba and everything that's entailed in defending Cuba by basically saying, oh, pobrecitos, they're part of this, awful effort by the United States to blockade Cuba.
Yep. Okay, then. So we have talked about President Trump's goals in Cuba. And Carrie, I think you started by saying they're not actually so different from the first administration, from the first Trump administration. Ultimately, the United States is trying to starve the regime in Cuba of the resources to harm the Cuban people, hoping to bring about economic reforms that might then lead to political reforms as well. That was part of the strategy before. And you've talked about some of the threats that exist and emanate from Cuba. So, of course, we have the crank piece. There's the signals, the espionage bases that Ryan, you and your team have worked on and helped identify. But there's also the harm to U.S. diplomats, Havana syndrome, the spying in the hotels as well. And so when you're talking about the options now that President Trump is pursuing, I think you started by talking about the back channels and saying maybe this might work more this time than it has in the past, given that it's directly with the Castros. There's this focus on the economic reforms there. You both seem to think there is no Delcy Rodriguez option for Cuba. And
nor should there be.
Nor should there be. Okay, yes. And then when we started talking about the military piece, I think you said, the military option is hard to imagine while the war in Iran is going on. It would require a lot of planning, and it would probably be very complicated. I think you questioned, does President Trump really want a major war just, 90 miles from the border or from the shores of Florida? So then I think we come back to sort of these goals of maximum pressure, exerting influence to try to bring about these changes and these economic reforms. And there could be real benefits of that. One, of course, is to kick out Russia and China from a part of the Western Hemisphere where they have really got a solid base. There's the human rights piece, the benefits that would come to the political prisoners, to Cubans who are suffering under this system. And then the economic benefits that could open up. Ryan, you're saying it's essentially part of North America and there could be real economic benefits there. But of course, there are also some risks. So, risky to do military operations on this scale, the potential for migration. So is Cuba next? I guess maybe like one final word from each of you. Is Cuba next? Yes or no?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think we're coming to a head on Cuba. I think Iran that chapter will close. The conflict will end at some point. Operation Epic Fury will close. But I think when President Trump says Cuba is next, I think there really is a sense in which the system there is either about to collapse, or the leaders there are realizing that the system is about to collapse, and they're going to cut a deal.
Okay. Well, Carrie, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me. I have learned a lot from this. I've not been spending a lot of time thinking about Cuba. Maybe we should go have some Cuba Libres together. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker. Until next time.